It's time now for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, showbiz, sport, academia and beyond, plus those who simply have a big story to tell. Tonight, renowned NHS-trained cardiologist Dr Aseem Malhotra, campaigner, best-selling author and chair of Public Health Collaboration, a charity dedicated to informing and implementing healthy decisions. Aseem is a globally regarded specialist when it comes to diagnosing, preventing and managing heart disease. His areas of expertise include evidence-based medicine. Do you remember that? Do you remember evidence-based medicine? Collaborative shared decision-making with patients, obesity, coronary artery disease, preventative cardiology, as well as angina. Dr Malhotra graduated with a degree in medicine from the University of Edinburgh in 2001. He was shortlisted in the Sunday Times Debrett's list as one of the most influential individuals in the UK in the fields of science and medicine, a list which also included Professor Stephen Hawking. He says that he's on a mission to save lives, 1 million at a time. Well, he is 1 in a million, and he joins us now. Hello, Aseem.
Hi, Mark.
The doctor will see you now.
Great to see you.
Look, it's great to have you in the studio. What has the pandemic taught us about public health?
Well, that's a great question, Mark. I think it's exposed really the failure of public health, if you like, for a very long time to tackle chronic disease, because I think, as most people know now, once you take away the frail elderly, most of the risk from Covid-19, I even wrote a book about it, is related to diseases of lifestyle, excess body fat, and something that was highlighted on this program not so long ago was that when you look at people who died just purely of COVID, it was about 10% of the total deaths that we suffered from in this country. And what that means is most of those people that died had some underlying condition, and most of those conditions are related to excess body fat being driven by poor diet. And what we had was really a fast pandemic, which exploited a slow pandemic of chronic disease, which we failed to tackle for many years.
If we didn't have obesity, if we didn't have collectively as a nation a high BMI, how bad might the pandemic have been?
So I would actually take it a little bit further, because BMI is a little bit outdated, Mark, in the sense that...
Is it a blunt tool?
It's very blunt. I think, so in this country, just to remind the public of the statistics, which are still pretty shocking, more than 60% of adults in the UK are overweight or obese. More than 1 in 3 children by the time they leave primary school are in the same category. But beyond that, when we look at excess body fat that's harmful to health, that even affects people who have a normal BMI, that probably, we take that estimate up to about 80% of UK adults now having excess body fat that is a risk to their health. Yeah. So really that's the major issue that's been at the heart of this. And to answer your question about how many more lives could have been essentially saved or deaths prevented, one estimate suggested about 50% of the lives would have been saved from COVID if we had healthier lifestyles. I suspect it's probably more than that.
And we saw it, didn't we, even in the cabinet? I know it's not a scientific sample, but sure. The poor old Prime Minister, and our heart went out to him at the time. I was on national radio when he went into ICU on a Sunday night. But Boris Johnson is pretty stout gentleman. He gets COVID. It almost kills him. The rest of the cabinet get it. And it's like a nasty flu, nothing worse.
Yeah, absolutely. We've known for a long time, even before COVID, that excess body fat, for example, people who get flu are more likely to have severe illness. They carry the virus for longer. People with type 2 diabetes, high blood glucose, for example, viruses and bacteria thrive off high blood glucose. So in some ways, it was kind of predictable that we were going to have bad outcomes. And globally, Mark, as well, 90% of all the deaths that occurred from COVID happened in countries where more than 50% of the population were overweight or obese.
So we know about obesity and we know about type 2 diabetes. You use this expression, metabolic health, as an umbrella term for how sick we are in the West and the developed world. So what is metabolic syndrome?
So metabolic health is really, in very simple terms, a way of understanding the balance in the body between storing fat for energy and burning it. And if that goes out of balance, then you are at risk of having poor metabolic health. And there are 5 main markers which are really simple to measure. So, it incorporates blood pressure, whether you're a type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. increased waist circumference, and then an abnormal cholesterol profile. One of the things that's quite a crude, easy thing that for people to measure at home to tell whether they are potentially at adverse metabolic health is looking at their waist circumference and their height. And your waist circumference should be less than half of your height. And if it's more than half of your height, then you're probably heading down the wrong direction in terms of your health.
And the existence of a belly, which happens to all of us in middle age, that is actually a red flag. Is it? Do you think in society we rather underplay being overweight and we dress well to accommodate it? Is that a problem?
I think so, yeah. And also it's become more normalised, Mark, hasn't it? Because so many people are suffering with this problem. It's become normalised. So I think we need to really tackle it at the
We've seen a lot of newspaper reports about people, very sadly, in COVID, in ICU or even dying, being described as a healthy middle-aged man that essentially is, yields to the worst of COVID. But you might question how healthy they were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to know for sure. I'm sure I know people very healthy and very fit who have suffered badly from COVID. But in general, Mark, the likelihood is that they're going to have poor metabolic health. Now, one of the problems, or something I've campaigned on, is it's not part of the conversation that goes on in community within GPs and practices, in secondary care. But actually, that's what we should be focusing on, because metabolic health, is linked to, ultimately, it's the metabolic syndrome, which is having 3 of those 5 markers in the abnormal range, is the most important risk factor for heart attacks. It's likely, it drives type 2 diabetes. It's likely, a big driver of cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia. All of these conditions are rooted in poor metabolic health. So if we sort metabolic health out through lifestyle changes, then we are going to be in a much better position.
Well, that's the amazing thing. You've written lots of books about it, including the best-selling Piopi diet. And you, even though you're a cardiologist and you're willing to prescribe medication to patients that need it, you think prevention is better than cure, and you believe that diet is very powerful, a powerful lever to pull, the ultimate lever. So how do we fix that belly fat, the poor metabolic health, obesity? What can my viewers do, especially if they feel that they've piled on the pounds in lockdown, which many of us have?
Yeah. The good news is these metabolic health markers can be improved quite rapidly, within weeks to a few months of just changing diet alone. I mean, the other factors are, of course, really important, making sure you're reasonably active and getting enough sleep. But dietary change alone is the only intervention that's shown to reverse metabolic syndrome, the worst aspect of metabolic health, in up to 50% of people within 21 to 28 days. So what do you do?
Less than a month?
Absolutely. And this is what I do this with my
And you
patients.
don't believe in calorie counting or starving yourself.
No.
So
Granny wasn't counting calories, Mark.
No.
We didn't have
And
this,
she wasn't
the
fat.
50s and 60s. People weren't counting calories. What's driving this is something in the environment, and it's in the food environment. And the biggest culprit are what we call ultra-processed foods. Yeah. So these are industrially, produced products that are essentially normally 5 or more ingredients, come in a packet, unhealthy oils, sugars, and when they're combined together, these sorts of ingredients, they become hyperpalatable, so they're
designed to be delicious and addictive, aren't they?
Absolutely. And addiction's the opposite of free will. So the food industry have very cleverly engineered these products to get people hooked. They make lots of money. We get addicted, and then you've got an obesity epidemic.
So what's in and what's out? Sugar's out.
Yep.
And processed food, so anything in a box with 1 million ingredients.
Yeah, so listen, very simple. I tell my patients, 5 or more ingredients. If you pick up anything, even packaged bread, if it's got 5 or more ingredients, don't eat it.
Right.
Okay?
Well, that's good, because beer's only got about 3 or 4. So.
Yeah, beer's not included.
The doctor's not happy.
And low quality carbohydrates. So these are essentially your breads, your pastas, your rice, your potatoes in excess. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with having these as the occasional treat, but when you're already in this cycle of poor metabolic health, you need to go quite extreme at the beginning to sort of recalibrate.
Yeah.
And then you can, I then say once you've got to your optimum metabolic health that you can, then I'd say follow the 80-20 rule, which is what I do. 80% of the time you're pretty strict with your diet, and then you can, of course, enjoy the occasional treat. The problem is the occasional treat has now become part of the regular daily diet of the British public. And, more than 50% of the calories consumed in this country are from ultra-processed foods.
So we're not having processed foods, stuff in a box, more than 5 ingredients, those starchy carbohydrates, bread, pasta, rice, potatoes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these are basic carbs that like fibre.
And although fruit's okay, those tropical fruits are a bit tricky, right? Grapes.
Yeah, well, it depends where you're starting from, but in general, if people have, which again, most people in this country are going to be in this category, you want to really try and go for the low sugar fruits, your berries, that kind of stuff.
So what are we eating then? We're eating meat, fish?
Whole foods. Whole foods, absolutely.
Okay.
Meat, fish, eggs, nuts and seeds, vegetables, whole fruit, low sugar fruits ideally. All enjoyable stuff.
The pharmaceutical industry, they make medication. Are they our best friend or our worst enemy?
Wow. Really good question. I think probably the reality, and I'm going to elaborate on this now with you, Mark, probably more the latter. I think they're more like the worst enemy, to be honest. So let's start by just understanding, you mentioned earlier evidence-based medicine. So evidence-based medicine is what we should all be adhering to do as doctors. And there's an elegant triad that was created by the founding father of the evidence-based medicine movement, Professor David Sackett, about 25 years ago. And what it does, it incorporates your individual clinical expertise as a doctor and your clinical intuition, best available evidence, and take into consideration patient values and preferences to improve outcomes for patients. What does improve outcomes mean? Relieving suffering and pain, treating illness, managing risks. Now, the problem is, if there's any distortion of any of those components, you are going to ultimately either give useless treatments to patients or cause harm. So the reality, unfortunately, is when you look at best available evidence, it's been corrupted by vested interests. So John Ioannidis, I consider him to be a kind of Stephen Hawking-like figure in medicine, professor of medicine at Stanford. His own analysis a few years ago of 60,000 studies that were published, medical studies for therapeutic interventions, revealed only about 7% of them were actually found to be high quality and relevant to patients. He wrote another paper where he explains why most published research findings are false. So what's going on here? Well, at the root of it, I've mentioned this in a talk in European Parliament I gave in 2018. We have an epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed patients rooted in biased funding of research. So that's research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals. So in the medical journal, then they exaggerate the benefits of the drug, minimize the harms from what's then come from the drug industry. Biased reporting in the media, commercial conflicts of interest, and last but not least, an inability of doctors to understand and communicate health statistics. When you put that all together, you then create something called a medical misinformation mess, and then patients are ultimately getting drugs where, if they were fully informed, they would likely choose, in many cases, not to take the drug. So what you've got is huge waste. And when you talk about the pharmaceutical industry, you asked about worst enemy. What is their track record? Over the last 30 years, most of the drugs that have been produced have really been proven to be copies of old ones. So they change the molecules here and there, they patent it, make loads of money. By the time someone's figured it out, that they know better than a cheaper drug they could have used, they've moved on to the next drug. One analysis in France, Mark, between 2002 and 2011, looking at all the drugs that had been produced, found that there were twice as many drugs that were proven to be more harmful to patients than ones that were beneficial. And only 0.2% of the drugs that were produced, about 900 plus drugs over 10 years, that were approved by the regulator, only 0.2%, 1 in 500, were found to be actually of therapeutic clinical value of significance. So the net result of what pharma have been doing, they keep talking about innovation and blockbusters and, advances in medical science. It's, unfortunately, the reality is this, Mark. The business model of the pharmaceutical industry, in many cases, is one of fraud.
And I guess the issue is that doctors are therefore not asking the simple questions, which is, does the patient need this medication? Will it work? And is it worth any potential side effects?
Yeah, exactly, Mark. So I think, Carl Hennigan is the director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, as you may know.
Yeah.
And he actually describes it very eloquently. He says that every doctor, in any intervention you do with a patient, ask yourself, how much difference does it make? And how do I know this? Because once you ask those questions and you dig deep enough, you will then be able to at least have a more honest conversation with the patients about what are the potential harms, what are the uncertainties. I do this with my patients all the time. When I talk about statins, for example, I will say, well, this is a best case scenario. You say you're somebody that doesn't have heart disease, may have a few risk factors, but hasn't had established heart disease. Then I will say to them, listen, if you take this drug religiously every day for 5 years, based upon industry-sponsored trials, where the raw data has not been released for independent scrutiny, so likely best case scenario, there's a 1% chance, Mark, that it will prevent you having a heart attack, but it will not prolong your life by 1 day.
And there could be side effects.
And of course, that's before we even talk about side effects.
Because, I mean, this is your area of expertise. Of course, many will be watching and they feel that they owe their lives to certain medications. And I guess we should point that out. We shouldn't tar the whole industry with the same brush. But you know your stuff about cardiology and about statins. Would you care to tell us your assessment of statins and whether they are necessary or not? Because they're very profitable for the pharmaceutical industry, aren't they? How much money do they make from statins?
Well, I think it's estimated that they've made about $1 trillion
$1 trillion?
from the sale.
It's pretty good. It's got a T in it.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. Like with many drugs, Mark, they may benefit a certain group of people, but what the drug industry want to do is they want to expand the use of their drugs to make more money.
Because it's a business model.
Well, the drug industry, people need to realize that they have a legal obligation to produce profit for shareholders. They don't have a legal obligation to give you the best treatment, although most people would believe that to be the case. The real scandal is that, medical journals, academic institutions really collude, and doctors collude with industry for financial gain. And that creates, that adds to the whole if you like, the medical misinformation.
Well, it's like
it's institutional corruption.
It's like the dentists. I mean, put it crudely, like the dentists who'll do extractions. Just you don't need the tooth out, but they can make a few £100 from an extraction, and it's a more sort of sophisticated version of that.
Yeah,
and they want to make money. Their product, their commodity is the medication, and they'll do anything to sell it.
Yeah, and Mark, I think it's not about pointing fingers at individuals. I think most doctors want to do the right thing, but they're being given information that is biased. And one of the problems and why we're not tackling this is most doctors are not aware that a lot of the research that drives their clinical decision-making is poor quality and unreliable.
A bit like recent data saying that a good whole grain breakfast is really good for you, except that was sponsored by Kellogg's.
Well, there you go. You look
the money.
A lot of the media reporting influences a lot of doctors' decisions.
So before I bring my panel in, it's obviously a business model. That when you say people are, that money's involved, people are being bought. How so? How are the pharmaceutical giants actually using money as a leverage into the NHS and the media and politics? How are they doing?
Well, I think they capture different aspects of that system that influences what happens downstream. So, for example, most people probably aren't aware that the regulators, whether it's the FDA or the MHRA over here, can receive considerable money from the very industry they're supposed to be regulating. So there's a big conflict of interest there. And then that questions their independence. Are they being rigorous enough? That's one mechanism. And then, the drug industry there are there to try and, give the best.
And they splash the cash, right? They use money.
Absolutely. They use their
money.
How do they do
that? What do they do? Do they give doctors money?
Well, no, I don't think not directly. No, they don't give doctors money, but I think it's the way they influence they influence the politicians. I mean, in America, it's a bit different over here. They fund campaigns for politicians, so that becomes a huge, considerable amounts of money they give to different, interest groups, political interest groups that then influence legislation, which then means we have less regulation. They're able to get away with more.
Now, we're grateful for the medication that works, and you will concede that some medication works.
No, absolutely.
And it's life-saving. So how do we get the balance right? How do we get control back of this? Of course, we've got the NHS, which is, I guess, a unitary health service. How can we push back, and how do we recalibrate our relationship with Big Pharma? Can it be done? Is it too late?
Listen, I think one of the things that's most important is that we have to adhere to this evidence-based medicine triad, and doctors need to question a little bit more about the evidence base. We need less commercial conflicts of interest. And I think one of the things, Mark, moving forward, given the history of the last 3 decades of what really has been a lot of waste, a lot of unnecessary harm, a lot of unnecessary deaths.
And money spent.
Yeah, I think the drug companies who, obviously we need industry to create new products and new drugs. They shouldn't be allowed to test their own products and then hide the data from the public and from doctors. That's just ludicrous. It's nonsense. If you ask anybody, I have conversations with everybody around this, whether it's the cab driver or the barista in the coffee shop, and I explain this to them and they're shocked.